Now, chapter 10, part 2. So we're still in the second part, the highest level rights, dealing with welfare. This is the second video on welfare. So if you haven't seen the first part, go one video back, check that out, come back and join me. So in this section, Griffin's just fleshing out a few more ideas and thoughts and discussions on the notion of welfare. And welfare, remember, it's one of our fundamental values of autonomy, liberty, and welfare that play a role in the highest level rights. So we're finishing off Griffin's system here. And so he says, you know, some thinkers talk about restricting welfare to what, you know, the deserving, needy, whatever term you want, the poor or whatever. Some of them are not very nice terms, but anyway, you get the idea. Some people that need this help, and they honestly need it. So it's bad. It's not a good idea then to really think of welfare as universalizable. We shouldn't think of that. We should really think it's not universalized, and so if it's not universalized, then it's not a subset of human rights. And of course, the other thing is, if we want welfare rights to be a subset, to be in the human rights gang and the human rights family, if we want that, we should not, we cannot have any notion of desert built into welfare rights. So you shouldn't have any conditions on it, right? It shouldn't be that, well, you only get this welfare right is only yours provided that you are in need of some kind, right? So if you do, then that's not universal anymore, right? So this is a standard kind of thing that some philosophers and some thinkers and some politicians, they want to say, well, welfare rights really aren't like that. They're not universalizable. They shouldn't be universalized because welfare stuff goes to the needy. And you think about colloquial ways of using the term welfare. We do often use it as, well, welfare is, you know, you have to apply for it, and you have to demonstrate that you're in need in order to get it, and you could be refused it. So if you could be refused a service, then that service is, you know, it's not a human right if you could be refused it. Or at least it would seem that you'd have to tell a bit of a story of why you're refused or whatever if you want to keep it a human right. And that's a difficult story to tell. So if we want welfare rights to be a subset, we cannot have any notion of desert or like merit built in to welfare rights. Now, this can run into some you know, some thorny issues. Some say that there's a right to welfare like medical treatment, you know, and we shouldn't discriminate in any way. You know, like medical treatment should just be you know, regarded as a welfare right, you know. But, you know, you can cook up examples where it's not so easy. Like, because we have to take into account when we're dealing with goods like externalized goods like medicine, availability of a hospital bed, et cetera, there are practical and questions of scarcity. So here's just an example just to think about. Joe and Sam are both sick, right? You know, it's bad. They have lung cancer, something like that, and they will pass. They're both, the doctors have said, okay, these guys are not going to live if it's not treated. But if it is treated, both are such that it could be that could be cured, right? They could be saved from it. Okay. However plausible that is, let's just accept that as an argument here for the sake of argument. And then all of a sudden you're learning new things about it. Well, you learn, although they're both sick, Sam was a non-smoker, or sorry, Joe was the non-smoker, Sam was the heavy smoker. And Joe and Sam both knew about smoking in advance, you know, not a good idea. It's definitely linked to cancer and all that stuff. So Joe says, I'm not smoking. And Sam says, well, whatever, and smokes anyways. And then you say, okay, well, you know, I think most of us would say, well, you have limited resources. It should go to the person who, you know, avoided the cigarettes and, you know, took the warning seriously versus the one who ignored them. Okay, if you want to say that, you can probably, you know, it's not unreasonable to say that. You can muster an argument up to defend that. But what if you learn another piece of information that Joe and Sam, let's say for non-cancer related reasons, let's say Joe's health is bad in other ways, so that even if you got rid of his cancer, which might kill him very quickly, he's got other situations such that again, we don't have to worry about the details, but it would be the case that you cure Joe, but Joe would only have about another year of life, or maybe a year or two, and it wouldn't be that great. He'd be cancer free, but there would be other problems going on there, and that would unfortunately be terminal. So he might be suffering. Sometimes people are, sad cases, they're suffering from multiple problems, and so the cancer is only one. But Sam is not. Sam is, if it weren't for the lung cancer, Sam doesn't have any other issues going on. And so Sam, if you put the money into Sam's medical treatment, let's say, again, we're stacking the deck, but just to drive the point home, what if Sam could live 30 years, right? So in terms of the consequences, like 1 year of life versus 30, shall we say, more innocent bad luck, not so innocent, and kind of brought it on himself. How are you going to figure all this out, right? What do you do now? Who actually deserves the treatment? What should society do, et cetera, et cetera. Griffin says he's not sure, right? And he said these are thorny issues, and once you start building dessert into welfare stuff, you get all this, right? And he says, look, it's never been clear that people have really been able to handle dessert and welfare. He wants a cleaner version of a welfare right. He says, look, all I'm doing, I don't have to dig into all that. All I'm doing is the welfare, like, because as we saw earlier, like the minute you start bringing in a positive dimension to a right, like a welfare right, it's going to inevitably involve positive stuff. How much should it involve? And when it involves, what should it involve? You've got to start making choices about, is that relevant? Is that irrelevant? So once you bring in all these positivities and empirical conditions, put it this way, the empirical conditions that you bring in, they're not marked like I am relevant and I am irrelevant. We have to decide these things. So even when you start saying, oh, it's connected to empirical stuff, that doesn't always make it easier, because now you got to distinguish, even from a consequentialist angle, which consequences count. Do you stop here from a consequentialist line of reasoning and say, oh, well, I cure both, yeah, and I cure and innocent. I cure the innocent as a consequence is more valuable than a limited cure versus curing the responsible and a much more long result of the cure. Like, which are the better consequences, right? So is this relevant? Is this relevant? And how do you determine relevancy in a non-arbitrary way? It's often easy to make the decision, I just declare this relevant. But what if someone says, I don't think it's relevant? Then what do you do? Well, then you can say, well, I'm the doctor, I'm the boss, I own the hospital. But how do you do it in a non-coercive, a non-arbitrary way, a rational, defensible way? So again, Griffin says that's a mare's nest. I'm staying away from that one. I'm going to go with just saying that welfare deals with the agent's normativity, protecting that, the goods for that, not all of that stuff, and not a complete and flourishing life. So we've seen that, with our discussion in a previous video of the conceptualization of a worthwhile life, not just everyone, just kind of the real deep ones. Those ones will be protected. And it's more of just the ability to evaluate and structure them, not to get a particular one that you want. So again, he's always talking about not necessarily the goods that will give you what you want, but the goods for you to be able to form what you want and consider options and change your mind, to have the freedom and the liberty and the autonomy to do that. But you don't always get what you conceive of, right? You may not get what you want. So and with that sort of not a complete and flourishing life, well, he trucks out the old UDHR, which he complains about again. So clearly, as much as he likes the UN declaration for its emphasis on dignity, and he, as he said earlier, he likes that notion of dignity. He thinks a lot of the things in the UDHR are accepted, so he doesn't want to go back to Rawls's limited list. He does, and he thinks that that a lot of these things are good ideas, but he says in the end it's uncritically generous, and once again he trucks this one out about periodic holidays with pay. Is that a human right? So if a company hires you on a series of contracts, let's say consecutive contracts, they pay you, just for the sake of discussion, a lot of money for each contract, but you're never given holidays with pay. Whatever time off, you're off, and then you go on a new contract. But let's say you're paid, we can stack the deck here. Let's say you're paid a lot of money, that you have no problems. You can take a few weeks off, every couple of months and go traveling and goof off, and you have more than enough money to do that. Would you nonetheless say, as the UDHR would say, you're not getting periodic holidays with pay, your rights are being violated, your human rights are being violated, even though you're making a pile of money and you are taking holidays, but you're not getting holidays with pay. So that's what he means about this uncritically generous notion of the UDHR. And he also has another one about the right to justice. And he says, well, justice is a big concept. It includes procedural justice and distributive justice. Now, most of us don't really encounter procedural justice, right? Most of us are not charged and have to rely and hope for due process. Very few of us in the population actually, thank goodness, ever really engage the legal system where you're screaming about and demanding your right to procedural justice. That's quite rare. Distributive justice, we encounter that all the time. You encounter that when everybody, when you're supposed to pay your fare to get on the bus and someone doesn't, that's a violation of distributive justice. So we live in the world of distributive justice all the time, procedural not so much. So you would think the justice that we want living in all the time, but I think most of us would say, this one that we may never experience in our lives, many people live their whole lives and never, ever need procedural justice. I mean, it's like an insurance policy, but most people never need it. They never encounter it. And unfortunately, people encounter it and they're totally innocent. So you hope it's there. And then, of course, you have it as part of your normal working out of how society deals with people who've been charged with crimes. But, most people aren't. So this is like an insurance policy. So, yeah, that should be, and something that's very rare, that might be a human right. But something that's all the time might not be. And this is kind of uncritically generous to build this in, that you would want your life to totally be governed by the human right of distributive justice. Is that even feasible? So Griffin sometimes, is implying that, the UDHR was written up by a group of people and it was their views. And is this realistic? And again, he likes sort of the foundation of it, but doesn't think in the end that it's entirely realistic. Also, he also wants to distinguish between, various kinds of cutoff points, right? In the sense that, he gives examples of two people being paid extraordinarily well to do the exact same job. And both are paid very, very high salaries, but one person is paid a little bit more than the other. We would agree that there has been a moral transgression, but has there been a human rights violation if both people are paid almost the same amount of money and it's astronomical, right? So that nobody is, being paid poorly. But what if it's, it's the company's, the CEO's daughter or son that gets paid a little bit more? And you're being paid a little bit less, but you're still paid really well. Is that a human rights violation? Griffin doesn't think so. So he thinks that there are, certain kinds of, like that would be a case of injustice, but not a human rights violation. So, but if you changed it dramatically, maybe you might get into the realm of a human rights violation. But if it's really close and really high, not so much. So the human rights violation might be lowered, the pay there, or something might have to be different. There might be a kind of sliding scale. But the point is that the human rights violation is not coextensive with a moral transgression, which is once again Griffin saying that not all moral transgressions are human rights infringements, and not everything of moral significance is protected by a human right. Okay. He says, he ends his little discussion of the thoughts on the UDHR that says he says it has several, dubious elements in it, but he doesn't say exactly what should be done with these dubious elements. but again, he thinks that it's largely an overextension of welfare, and eventually can get into these problems where you've got questions of desert and relating to it. He wants to keep a very moderate notion of desert. That is that every agent that is capable of normativity, that is capable of forming these worthwhile conceptions, should be provided the goods, that is, the autonomy, the liberty, and the welfare to do so. Okay, so that brings us to the end of part 2. So now we've got the general theory, we've got the general theory in place, plus the three keystone, the key values that human rights are concerned with. And the next chapters, the next series of chapters is part 3. And there, Griffin will look at some very specific examples and see how they relate to this framework that he's been developing so far. See you in the next part.